Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Roshmik Saha, co-founder and CTO of Skyflow, and we'll be talking about why PII data isolation matters. Roshmik, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me back. It's always exciting to talk to you and discuss some ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for coming back. I'm glad that you're not tired of me yet, and we'll be seeing each other soon in person at reInvent. But anyway, what's new in your world?
So I'm in Australia this week, and the weather is very different than what I've seen before. Apart from that, in the last couple of months, I got to attend a few conferences, which many times I don't get to do because of my schedule and all. But it's very fascinating for me to get the validation from customers or prospects that what we thought about, what was ideas 4 years back, the technology we created, the product we created, actually resonates with customers now, people in the industry who are actually tackling this problem of PII and how to deal with sensitive data. The other interesting thing that I've seen happen over the last couple of months is that people are actually asking about how to solve it. Because from day one, I think privacy, everybody knew it was a problem. Everybody kind of said that, yeah, the solution you're talking about makes sense. But lately, I have seen that everybody is asking a slightly different question: is how do we solve it? So it has become urgent, and there are a lot of reasons why people want to solve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like, I do think it's incredibly validating that, if you look at sort of the timeline where Skyflow started, it was, essentially 2019. So, a little over 4 years ago at this point, pretty far ahead of, I think, where we are now, or like essentially looking ahead at the time. Like, the world was different in terms of the way it was thinking about privacy. There was GDPR that came in 2018, but since then there's been, especially in the last couple of years, this huge growth in a variety of different privacy regulations and concern over privacy regulations as well. And that's probably also feeds into maybe this transformation that you're seeing in terms of people now asking kind of the right questions around, like, how do we actually solve this problem? So it's not just, sort of an afterthought, but it's one priority for the business, but also they're kind of thinking about it from more of a first principles approach of how do we actually solve this, rather than how do we, maybe put a Band-Aid on it, or, check off something to kind of say that we're compliant, but not necessarily solve the underlying problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I just spent a few weeks in India. The DPDP law just got passed, and everybody now knows that they have to do something about it. They have to, and I think the cost is also becoming a problem. People are now trying to estimate how much they're going to spend solving this problem. So I think having APIs for a solution is a good idea.
Yes. Yeah. So very good, great forward thinking there, and very validating. So today, we're talking about PII data isolation, which is I think a core sort of principle of some of the, architecture and decisions that we've made at Skyflow. But maybe to start a little bit more general, outside of just purely PII, what is the principle of isolation?
So the idea of isolation is quite simple. To me, it means that you just isolate different types of things. You put your valuables in a different place, maybe called a locker. You put your general edibles in your kitchen. There are different reasons why we should isolate things, or why we have always been isolated things. So even I believe that as soon as human beings started storing anything, be it food, be it valuables, they had a principle of isolation in their mind, even as a concept. So like as soon as we had agriculture was established, I am pretty sure that grains and vegetables were not safe together, because they just have a different life cycle. So, and they impact each other in negative ways. So as soon as we had the concept of value, you never put the valuables along with your food, right? I have heard you mention the cheese and the diamond story a few times, and I think it was natural to for human beings to keep things separated out. Even if you look at a well-organized person, they put things separately so that they can quickly find the things they want. They don't lose stuff, which is not very different than losing data, right? And yeah, in terms of data, I think when it comes to any kind of data, we need to isolate it based on usage patterns, access patterns, nature of the data. Like you never stores relational data and time series data and um, like NoSQL data in the same place, right? And also based on traffic, if you need a high throughput data access patterns, and if you want to save like blobs where you know that you will only be accessing it in a slow fashion, or like cold storage versus hot storage, there are so many different reasons, and people have used it all over the place, calling it isolation or not, but it has been there forever.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point in terms of isolation is something that we kind of all do and has been part of like human history. It feels very natural to put in certain, objects in, or, or food or something like that, separate from other places, because we know that it might impact it, or maybe the rules of engagement are different, or, even one of the stories I always tell is that, if you walked into an office building from, 50 years ago, it's not like the employee records, the financials of the business, the customer records are like on paper out on the desk for everybody to see. They're probably at the very least locked in a file cabinet somewhere where, very few people have access to the lock, or maybe in a bigger business, even within some sort of vault within the company where they keep like their extra sensitive documents where very few people have access. But for whatever reason, we've done some of this kind of stuff with data, but we haven't really thought about it in terms of PII data isolation. Why do you think that is?
So I think like people used to save passwords in their databases, right?
Yeah.
And it was not a long time ago. Actually, I did a presentation a few weeks back, and I actually asked the question to the audience, and the response, let me just say, was non-zero, who are still saving their passwords in the database. So I think it's um, it's important to isolate the PI data, but it always happens in steps, let me just say. So passwords, now everybody knows that keys and passwords goes into like a key manager and a secrets manager. Has it is it 100%? No, it's not 100% yet. It takes time for people to change how they handle data. PII being a separate use case, I think has become more and more important, maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, where privacy has become a very important aspect legally and financially, and in terms of building customer trust. And at the same time, you have to invest money. So if you look at KMS, the key management systems or secret managers, they don't come in cheap. So you have to spend money on it. You have to implement a different layer which deals with your keys and secrets. So I think it's you always need to have a business reason and a financial reason to do things. So now is the time where data privacy vault kind of makes sense, where PII data can uh, make business, or you will have good business reasons and financial reasons to invest in something like a vault.
Mm-hmm. Just going back to like the example of like a KMS or like a secrets manager, what is, I guess, like the main value that you're getting as an organization of using sort of that like architectural pattern or that pattern for isolating that particular type of data versus the old way where we probably would have just stuffed it in a database, or maybe even things like secrets could have been part of our source code.
Yes. So when it comes to isolation or protecting any piece of data, there are two aspects. One is what is the storage and what is the access pattern. So if you think about encryption, it protects the data because the key to unlock the data is not in the same place. So unless you have very different access control for the key, encryption has no value. If you just put the encrypted data and the key next to each other, there is no protection you get. The second thing is like, how do you protect the storage of the key? And that, of course, is much more complex than just putting the data in a database. So these are the two aspects that is the same. Like if you go to Secrets Manager, it has different access control and different storage. If you think about the Privacy Data Vault, it has like different storage and different access control.
Yeah, so just kind of like parsing out a little bit with the database, the people who are designing a database are designing it with one particular like use case in mind, which might be, essentially like the CRUD operations that you're going to be performing on the data that's related to a business. So their expectations around control of the data within the database is different than when we're talking about encryption keys, because there you don't necessarily want people just being able to query and pull encryption keys. You need a lot more control over it. And then that means that there's a different level of security that you need to build in, and you probably need essentially specialists or experts that know how to build it and understand those use cases, and they're building it specifically to solve that problem, just like the database people are going to be solving specifically database problems.
Yes. And just touching upon like a few things we discussed earlier, like access pattern, the rate of use, they are very different. So if you have used a secrets manager or a key manager, you know that you cannot make a lot of API calls to it. You cannot have a lot of different versions of the keys. So the limits on a secret or on a key is very different than the limits on what you can do with your SQL database or a NoSQL database.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's something that we, like, even going back to the example of like cold storage versus hot storage, there, your expectations about how often you need to access cold storage, you're setting that expectation. Like it's called cold storage for a reason. So you don't need to, you're basically, your main objective there is like, I need large volumes of data where I can put this stuff. The objective isn't necessarily being able to respond to a query until 10 milliseconds, but essentially your transactional database, that might be the main objective. So you need to be dealing with technologies that are specifically designed to essentially satisfy that use case.
Yeah. Just imagine putting like, thinking about like a cache which runs on flash drive or RAM, and think about cold storage, which has like really cheap storage. It cannot be equivalent. So you have to have a completely different system to support these two very different use cases.
Yes. So going back to essentially the PII, what are the potential risks and consequences of not effectively isolating PII data?
I think today some of the laws and compliance actually dictates what you have to do. So there is a legal implication on how you handle PII data. There are things like GDPR, there are things like residency laws, which actually tells you where you can save the data. There is potentially a financial aspect because not only do you have to be compliant, but if you lose PII, then you have to pay fines. And we have seen how big those fines can be, right? And that number, I think, has significantly gone up. And it will, like looking at the future, looking at the wordings of some of the laws that are coming in, the fines will be like bigger than what we have seen till now. So these are kind of some of the legal and business implications. But thinking about customer trust, like more and more people are becoming privacy aware. So they want to know where their data is saved, how the data is used, who has access to the data. And it will be harder and harder for businesses to gain customer trust without having good security posture or privacy posture. So I think Apple has done a great job of making privacy a feature. And I think more and more companies will do it. And not having that it might become hard to get customers.
Yeah, don't you think also that because of some of these, of both privacy awareness and also some of the regulations, things like right to be forgotten, data residency you mentioned, even something like I want to know what you're storing and how you're using it, becomes kind of like a forcing function for PII data isolation. Because if you're not isolating the data, in the case of data residency, then it's going to be really hard for you to essentially figure out how do I like shard my customer data based on like different regions of the world where my customers are based, or in the terms of right to be forgotten, then I need to chase down all these different locations if I have them in 10,000 locations. So all these things essentially become not there's basically conceptual reasons for why you'd want to isolate the data, but then there's also just like these sort of like things that are forcing people to be thinking in this way.
Yes, I think people who have dealt with GDPR, they know that deleting one piece of data is not that hard. But GDPR became like a multi-year, multi-million dollar project for any big enterprise. So it was because the data was everywhere. People did not know where the data was, right? And a privacy data vault or PII vault is just the logical way or the clean architectural way of solving the problem. So I think people are understanding that, and people are getting to make a decision that will they have like 1,000 bandits and they will be like spending years to fix a problem, or they just pay the price upfront, choose a clean architecture, and then solve a lot of problems.
So isolation's, clearly part like a core principle around the PII data privacy vault. But how would you essentially explain what a PII data privacy vault is for someone who doesn't know what that is?
So I would just say like how you save secrets in a secret manager, how you save your valuables in a bank vault. PII is a different data category, and where you keep your data is PII data is in a PII data vault. And if you want to like double click on kind of the technology or kind of the features you get, um, so protecting the data is important. So if the data you just put it uh, in any place, be it any database, and you just don't have access to the data, it's completely isolated. Then it's completely safe, but it's completely useless for the business. So the challenge is really how to protect the data but keep it usable. So what a data privacy vault does is guarantees that the data is protected but usable at the same time. So like you need the credit card to actually make a payment. You actually need the SSN to file your taxes. So there are use cases for every PII or sensitive data, and we just make sure that uh, the data is none of the business use cases are broken after you put the data in a privacy vault. So uh, going back in the past, like I used to work for autonomous cars, and if a car is not moving, it's completely safe. But the idea was to make a car move autonomously and to still keep everybody around the car safe, the car itself safe. So that's what PI data vault is: protecting your data and keeping the lights on for your business.
Yeah, so it's not purely about secure storage. That's like one thing. But if you lock it up and throw away the key, it's not super useful. Like the reason we keep customer data is so we can use it. So it's really about how you can also enable essentially privacy safe usage of the data in a way that is secure, compliant, and doesn't cause all these problems that historically have been challenges for companies to solve.
Yeah.
Could you explain the concept of zero trust and how it relates to PII data isolation?
So I think zero trust is a very good way of protecting and securing any software system you are building today. So, so if you think about a bank locker, so employees have access to it. customers have access to it, and maybe some cleaning staff has access to it. So a bunch of people do have access to the building. But inside, like if everybody could access everybody's else's data, there is not a whole lot of point of having the bot, right? So it is very similar to our backend systems where to get in, you need to authenticate yourself. So your identity is verified. But if you don't make sure that at every point, at every thread boundary, or every service boundary, every security boundary, you're not validating who the user is, and if they have access to that part of the system, you are not really doing justice to building a secure system. It's and that's the reason why it becomes super important when you are implementing like a PII vault or anything to do with security. What it basically means in engineering terms is you trust and verify uh, at every point. So what it means to us is that if the end user doesn't have access, is not authorized for accessing some part of the data or some part of compute, they should never be able to use the system. And in a microservices world, it means that you have to do it in multiple places, and you can never leave any point unprotected.
Does the fact that in this world we're isolating PII data into a special location make essentially controlling access, like essentially implementing zero trust and as always verifying access based on what it is that someone might need to do with the data? Does it simplify that problem and essentially building that versus if we didn't have the principle of isolation in the first place, and then we were trying to essentially apply these rules with the data kind of stored conventionally in a database mixed with all kinds of other things?
One of the biggest benefit of data isolation is how access control gets simplified. So if you have all kinds of data, then you have all kinds of systems and people trying to access the data. So if you have only one kind of data, then the number of systems that will try to access the data, or number of people who should have access to the data, is now becomes limited, and the types of people also become limited. So the access control really is, in my opinion, a untractable problem. If you put all kinds of data together, it becomes a much simpler problem. So implementing something like a fine-grained access control policy in a data vault is much simpler than if you want to do it in your backend with all kinds of data in the same database.
And what are some of the challenges with actually pulling this off with isolating PII data, especially in the case where maybe I don't have a system set up like this today?
Yes. So building a PII data vault, or like building a system where you have isolated all the data, is it's not that straightforward, and it is expensive. So first of all, you have to isolate everything. So I think engineers are trained to reuse systems, but this is one place where we have to kind of forget some of the training we have had, and we have to choose not to reuse existing systems from the existing backend. So the database has to be a different instance. The infrastructure should be completely separated out. The access control, you should not have the same access control, because the kind of users and systems that will have access to the PII data should be completely different than people who have access to the rest of the backend system. So then the next big challenge comes in once you have isolated the data, like how do you make it usable? So there, Skyflow has come up with something called polymorphic encryption, where we make sure that we are still working in the encrypted world, but can process operations and process queries from our customers. And then you have to think about, like, you have to implement something where you only give access to data when it is really required. So, like, I think if there was a parallel to need to know basis, that's exactly what you have to implement as your policy. So, even if somebody is authorized to view the data, but they don't really need to look at the data right now, they should not have access to the data. So, yeah, it's a mix of data protection, it's a mix of access control, and it definitely is a big infrastructure play, because infrastructure is definitely the first layer of protection.
Yeah, and implementing some of these, rules around like data minimization and essentially the principles of least privilege, like the way you express it of kind of like you're on a need to know basis, becomes easier also when you're isolating the data, because essentially you can control the rules of engagement specifically for this type of data to support whatever workflow that individual needs to accomplish to basically do their job.
Absolutely.
What are some real world examples of organizations that have done something like this? Not necessarily Skyflow, but other businesses that have treated data in this way and built similar infrastructure.
Yes. So I think Apple, Google, Netflix, they're all companies that we know of have done it. There are also financial institutions that had to do something like a vault because of regulations and because they wanted to really protect the data they had. I don't know the exact extent of or the details of what they had built, but they are all proprietary solutions which they were probably fine-tuned to their own use cases. But the principles are the same, that they were normally built by separated out teams. The infrastructure was different, the access control was different, and not anybody, either a customer or an employee by default, did not have access to those parts of the data.
Yeah, my understanding is in the case of like both Shopify and Netflix, which are examples of companies that have built something similar, they built them specifically for solving like analytics, like an analytics use case. Like how do we essentially descope our data lake or lakehouse or data warehouse, whatever they're using for analytics, from seeing any of the sensitive data and sort of bring that into a single source of truth in the vault architecture, and just kind of like use references within the analytics layer. And that way they can make sure that the analytics team has access to the data they need to do their job, but essentially they're seeing like an anonymized version of that information.
I also know about systems where some companies call it a vault, and they do have a vault, but they do also have the plain text data. So when the use cases, they hit a use case where they cannot run it on the vault, then they go back to the plain text data. So that's where I think organizationally, if we separate out the ownership of the plain text data, it makes a huge difference in the architecture, because then you cannot access the plain text data in the raw form, right? As a whole. So there should be no way to bypass it, because if the same company is owner of the plain text data and the owner of the encrypted or the vault and the tokenized data, there will be a backdoor. So it will, and I was kind of laughing at it, but it is a serious problem that people have.
Yeah, so that's kind of a reason for going with someone else to sort of own that part of it, because they can guarantee the controls and the isolation of the data, especially when it comes to access to the plain text data. But if the organization has that, it's very hard for them, under certain deadlines, sprints coming up, we need to release a feature, like there's always kind of reasons to create some sort of backdoor into the systems just in case you need it, sort of situation, right?
Absolutely.
Where do you think things, new innovations in the space of, data security, things like secure enclaves, what kind of role would might they play in the world of essentially isolation and protection of PII data?
Yeah, so secure enclaves are really is an interesting technology. So I think it's becoming more and more usable as we talk. We had looked at these technologies 4 years back. I think they have been in the market for some time now. But it's very interesting and to see the evolution of it. They will have a big role to play in the PII or data protection world. One of the very good use cases for secure enclaves is to do the encryption and the decryption part. So basically, if you can push all the plain text data handling into the enclave, or actually, let me put it this way, if you can restrict the key access to just the enclave, then you can completely protect your keys. And if you can completely protect your keys, then if the rest of the system only has access to encrypted data, then as a whole, you can protect the data in a much better way. Um, are we there yet? I don't think so. It will be very interesting for me to see, like, it's the same problem that we discussed. If Enclave gives you complete isolation, then is it usable? So, how much usable they can make without really breaking some of the principles of the Enclave will be interesting to watch. And I do think a lot of good progress is being made. AWS Nitro is a very good example that we actually are using. So, yeah, as an industry, I think I know a lot of startups that are making products on top of enclaves. So, I'm really interested in seeing how it goes.
Yeah. So with the particular use case you were mentioning there of protection around the encryption keys in the enclave, that essentially would stop any kind of memory attack that might happen, where someone could dump the memory during like a decryption operation, or where the keys stored, and get access to the keys. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So, and actually, a major threat is like there are many fancy hacks that people can theoretically do, and it's always fun to kind of read about them and actually write software to protect against it. But we should always think about insider threat, because if you look at all the data breaches, most of the breaches happen because of somebody who has some kind of access to the data, right?
Right.
Be it a bad player, or be it the credentials getting lost to a hacker from an employee of the company, right? And when it comes to that, what you have to make sure, and zero trust is a great way, like a great tool to fight against that. And also something like an enclave, where you are basically saying that nobody has access to the key. So if we can guarantee that, you can actually guarantee that nobody can have like a nobody will be able to come in and dump the data out, right? Or dump the plain text data out, because encrypted data doesn't have any value. So those are some of the ways I think we should think about when we really want to protect data.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're right. Like a lot of these breaches or ransomware, various attacks happen because of either a compromised employee, or it could be even directly from an employee who has not just access but like too much access, or it's another case against the sort of trying to do this yourself, because if you have that back door, then someone could actually within your organization exploit the back door
Yeah.
that leads to these problems as well.
Yes. So for your employees not have to have zero access, the only way to do it is where somebody else owns the vault and nobody in the organization has access to the data, right? So and so let's take the case for like the different parts of the government, right? So IRS has a lot of your PI data, like sensors, like the the Center for Commerce has a lot of your data, but nobody really has access to the data from a different part of the government, right? So IRS cannot look at your census data. They cannot look at your. They probably have access to all your financial data, but they don't have access to other kinds of data, your health information. So, technically speaking, there is still they will have to raise a ticket. They will have to file a case. They will have to uh, file some legal paperwork to have access to the data. So you would want that kind of a separation. So if everything is part of the same system, where you don't have to let everybody else know that you have access to the data, then so putting it in a vault doesn't mean that nobody else can have access, but you will have a paper trail. You will have somebody authorizing that access when you're not supposed to, or you don't have
Yeah.
access to by default.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's similar to like if you put your money in a bank, the money is in a vault, but then I'm able to use the money essentially through a proxy service of like a credit card or a debit card. I'm not actually going into the vault and like, taking the money out or something like that. So there's ways of essentially in the bank vault world, you're isolating, protecting, and relying on the vault's infrastructure to protect, your financial asset, but you're still able to actually use it. And no one sort of thinks twice about that. The fact that, well, most people anyway, unless you're stuffing your money under your mattress, but most people trust that system is probably better than what they could do at home, relying on their own, security measures and the obfuscation of putting it under the mattress.
Yeah, a very simple check is, does your cleaner have access to the money? So
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, what advice would you give organizations that are looking to, strengthen their PII data isolation practices and, enhance their overall data security posture?
yes, so I think the first thing is identifying what all PII data you have access to, or you're collecting, or you're sharing. And then the second part will be to really know where you really need to use the PII. So anywhere you don't need to access the PII, don't, right? That is one of the biggest kind of architectural or design problems that we have seen. That by default, people just access the data. They are not sure if they will need it, or they think that they might need it in the future, so they just have access. So that's a bad practice. Once you have kind of an understanding of your system and you have reduced the use of PII, that is the time where you should start putting your PII in a separate place. So that's the point you start isolating the PII. And the next step is basically thinking about tokenization. So what are the places where you really need the real data? Does a token suffice? We'll see that like the largest portion of the use cases just needs a token, not the real data. And then think about how much you can isolate. Like, can you have a subsystem which can detokenize and call a third-party API? Does the rest of the system really need it? So suppose you are sending out your e-commerce company and you are sending out packages to your customers. So only the delivery system needs to know the address. Till the point before that, you can just pass in the token. And the system that prints out the label or creates the FedEx ticket, that's the only system that needs to know the actual address. So I think solving it from architecture perspective is much better than if you think that, hey, how many different access controls can I buy, or how many security products I can buy so that I can prove that the data is secure. You will always find holes, and you will never be able to solve the insider threat problem. You will not be able to solve like even properly the access control problem if you're not thinking about isolation. So yeah, it's a long way, but it's a guaranteed way to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, like certainly historically, we've kind of convinced ourselves that we need access to data, throughout the entire system. I want to be able to access this in any microservice or any component and be able to pass it around. But it's actually very rare that you actually need access to like the raw data about a customer's name or address or something like that. Like maybe if I'm rendering it, maybe under certain sort like reports that I run, maybe a subset of it when I need to communicate with a third party API to carry out some sort of functionality, like I don't know, mail a letter or and carry out a credit card transaction or something like that. But most of the time, internal systems, we really at the very most need a proxy to the information. So to your point about most of the time, some sort of tokenized version of the data is probably good enough.
If you have noticed, like Google has come up with like a token for the address. So it's basically characters and special signs which will exactly tell what the location is, but it doesn't have any names or street numbers in it. So that is still like, it's not like full encryption, like it's more like a hash, and you can kind of you can break it. But the thing is, it's so simple. Like, I think there will be a day where you're just putting a code for an address and you don't really need to know anything more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideal situation in the United States for like a social security number would be we would stop giving away our social security number to everybody, and we would give some sort of like tokenized version of that would allow them to use the social security number for whatever they need to use, but it expires, or you have control of essentially the access rather than it just being everywhere and essentially in everybody's database at this point.
Yes, and I think when you talk about SSN, what people really need is to validate that this SSN belongs to this person, or they're basically doing identity check. Like IRS has your SSN, right? They don't need to know your SSN. They just need to know that you are the person whose SSN this number is, right? So I think validation can be done without access to the data. And that's the part where people should really think about moving compute into this isolated environment where you can get answers, get decisions out, and not still look at the actual data. So, yeah, and there are lots of technologies that have already been built around it. There are ways to do it. You just have to make sure that you want that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole space of like zero knowledge proofs, but a lot of the times what we want to do with the actual customer data is like assertions on the data. We want to know someone's older than 18 or 21 or something like that. We don't actually need to know their date of birth. We just need to know, true or false, is this person of age or lives in this particular area or whatever it is in order to support that workflow. But then we've essentially convinced ourselves that we need the raw data to do that. But really, we just need to perform business logic in isolation, essentially compute within the secure environment where the PII data lives, not exposing our systems to the actual underlying information.
And if you can achieve that, I think that reduces the data privacy, data security problem a whole lot. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, as we start to wrap up, Roshmik, is there anything else you'd like to share on this topic?
No, not much. I think thanks for having me, Sean. This is always a very interesting discussion to have for me. And it's great to watch your show and hear about everything that is going on, not just in privacy, but in general in the software world, in like LLM world, and so on. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being a part of this. And I will see you soon in Las Vegas at AWS reInvent.
Thanks, Sean.
Cheers.